The Olivet Discourse, Part 1. The context of Matthew 24 and the abomination of desolation. This is Robert Hilligans, author of The Early Date of Revelation and the End Times. The book of Revelation is known as the Apocalypse, while the Olivet Discourse is known as the Little Apocalypse. The discourse is smaller. The context and parallel passages in Mark and Luke are key to understanding Matthew 24, the most complete version of the discourse. The widely known Olivet Discourse was given by Jesus. After condemning the Jewish leaders, Matthew 23, Jesus, along with his disciples, went to the Mount of Olives, where he predicted the destruction of the temple, and that this destruction would take place within the lifetime of some of his listeners. See Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. The discourse is known among both Christians and non-Christians for its prophetic signs of the end. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes. This beginning of birth pains described in Matthew 24 verse 8 gives rise to increased tribulation and culminates with the appearance of the final sign, the abomination of desolation. With the appearance of the abomination that causes desolation, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains, but immediately after the tribulation of those days. The stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Matthew 24, verses 29 and 30. Many Christians today believe that these two verses give a description of the coming end of the world at the second physical coming of Christ, which will be upon us after a brief period of tribulation. Are we, today, entering the final phase of this tribulation? Many Christians today hold this opinion. While many Christians support this view and pay meticulous attention to the particulars of Matthew 24, they tend to pay less attention to the details of the immediate context found in Matthew 23, the cultural context, the parallel passages of Mark 13 and Luke 21, and the Old Testament prophets. In this video, we will consider the interconnections of these details to better understand Matthew 24. One cannot understand Matthew 24, the most complete version of the discourse, without them. The immediate context just prior to giving the Olivet Discourse, while still in the temple with his disciples, Jesus gives 8 condemnations or woes against the scribes and the Pharisees. Matthew 23, verses 13 through 29. After these condemnations, Christ pronounces judgment against the scribes and Pharisees and their temple, to which Jesus once referred to as his Father's house. See John 2, verse 16. This sets the immediate context for the discourse. The first woe, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from people, for you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in." 7 more woes follow. After the 8th condemnation, verse 29, Jesus tells the scribes and Pharisees of his time that they are the climax of all those who committed the historical transgressions against God and the prophets. The crucifixion of Christ would be the consummation of all the historical transgressions against God and the prophets. Jesus says to the scribes and Pharisees, "So you testify against yourselves that you are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Go ahead then and complete what your ancestors started." Matthew 23, verses 31 through 32. "See, your house is left to you desolate." Matthew 23, verse 38. Judgment on Jerusalem and the temple did come upon this generation in the lifetime of some of these Jewish leaders. With the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70, the temple would be abandoned in the most final way possible. It would no longer exist. The key time constraint of this generation given by Jesus to his audience of the scribes and Pharisees concerning the destruction of the temple is repeated in the Olivet Discourse. Only this time his audience was his disciples. In Matthew 23, verse 36, Christ says to the scribes and Pharisees, "Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." In Matthew 24, verse 34, to his disciples, Christ says, "Truly I say to you, This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. The phrase, this generation, or close variations, this wicked generation, is mentioned 16 additional times in the Gospels, all referring to the audience being addressed by Jesus. Matthew 11, verse 16, 12, verse 41, 12, verse 1242, 12, verse 45, Mark 8, verse 12, 8, verse 38, 13, verse 30, Luke 7, verse 31, 11, verse 29, 11, verse 30, 11, verse 31, 11, verse 32, 11, verse 50, 11, verse 51, 17, verse 25, and 21, verse 32. Each instance refers to the generation that Jesus was addressing. The close correspondence of these two verses in topic, wording, and timing indicates that the phrase, this generation, repeated just hours apart if interpreted literally, refers to the identical generation, the Olivet Discourse. We will primarily focus on the versions of the discourse found in Matthew and Luke, since Matthew's version was given to a Jewish audience. In contrast, the version of Luke was given to a Gentile audience that was not as familiar with Jewish culture and tradition. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. This pointing out of the buildings of the temple by the disciples was a response to the prophecy of Jesus that the temple would be left desolate. Many first-century Jews, however, believed the temple would last forever, and he built his sanctuary like the heights, like the earth which he has established forever. Psalm 78, verse 69. For I have chosen and consecrated this temple so that my name may be there forever. 2 Chronicles 7, verse 16. Then the Babylonians destroyed the Solomonic temple. When the temple was rebuilt, the belief returned to many Jews of the indestructibility of the temple, despite the curses for disobedience they brought upon themselves. Deuteronomy 28, verses 15 through 68. The Jewish philosopher Philo, just a few decades before the destruction of the Herodian temple, writes, For as long as the race of mankind shall last, the revenues likewise of the temple will always be preserved, being in their duration coeval with the universal world. See Philo of Alexandria. In his special laws, 1:1476, Kenneth Gentry's quote of Philo in the Olivet Discourse, made easy. For many first-century Jews, the destruction of the temple would mean the end of the world. They could not comprehend the existence of a world without the temple. The Herodian temple was a seemingly impregnable fortress, a place of refuge that could be fled to with the approach of invading armies. Their entire way of life was centered around the temple. With the temple made desolate, as predicted by Jesus to the scribes and Pharisees, the yearly pilgrimages to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, the Feast of the Tabernacles, and the Feast of Weeks would all be gone. Most importantly, no sacrifice could be made for the forgiveness of sin. That sacrifice must be performed in the temple. The destruction of the temple in AD 70 did forever change Jewish worship and their way of life. Their worship and civilization were forced to go through radical change. The religion became centered around a collection of the commentaries of Jewish wise men that we know today as the Talmud. The destruction of the temple would be so life-changing that it would seem to be the end of the world. It was the end of their world. The destruction of the temple would be the end of the age for the first-century Jew. With your house left to you desolate, the prophecies of the Old Testament were fulfilled 40 years after a final prophecy of Christ given at his trial before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, Matthew 24. Jesus walks out of the temple when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them as translated in the ESV, or replied to them as translated in the CSB. Their pointing out the buildings of the temple prompted the incredibly forceful reply of Jesus, "Do you see all these things? Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left here on another that will not be thrown down." Then Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked Jesus privately, Mark 13, verse 4, tell us, when will these things happen? Or Matthew 24-3, tell us, when will these things be? Or Luke 21-7, teacher, when therefore will these things happen? However, in Matthew's version of the discourse, the disciples asked Jesus the remaining question differently. And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Notice that there is one sign, not many signs, along with the conjunction and which joins with end of the age in the phrase your coming in Matthew's version. The one sign comes immediately after the prophecies of wars, earthquakes, plagues, and persecution written in both Luke 21 and Matthew 24, and each version ends with the identical warning. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. In Matthew 24, verse 15, we read, so when you see the destructive desecration mentioned by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader take note. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Daniel 11, verse 31 is a prophecy regarding Antiochus Epiphanes setting up the abomination of desolation. In 167 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes conquered Israel, plundered the temple, set up an image of Zeus on the altar, and required sacrifices be made to Zeus. Jews, under the threat of death, were made to sacrifice pigs on the altar to Zeus. The desecrations of Antiochus Epiphanes are described in detail in 1 Maccabees 1 verses 54 through 61. In 70 AD, the abomination of the banner of the 10th Roman legion flew in Jerusalem when Titus entered the temple. Josephus writes in his Wars of the Jews in chapter 647 that Titus entered the Holy of Holies. Titus was standing in the holy place. The book of Matthew was written to the Jews and makes direct reference to this important part of Jewish culture. The book of Luke was written to the Gentiles who were not that familiar with Jewish culture and the desecration of Antiochus. In Luke 21, Luke directly writes, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, the abomination of the Roman armies that destroyed the temple, as recorded in Luke 21, was the abomination that caused desolation, and corresponds to the abomination of desolation referred to in the parallel passage of Matthew 24. To navigate around the seeming inconsistency in the questions asked by the disciples in the versions of the Gospels, dispensational commentators claim that Matthew left out the answer of Jesus to the first question of when will these things be? They claim, despite the scriptural, cultural, and historical correspondences, that the answer to the primary first question is only to be found in Luke 21, verses 20 through 24, where Jerusalem is surrounded by armies. They claim that the abomination of desolation of Matthew 24 is not the desolation and destruction caused by the Romans in the prophecy of Jesus, but still is in our future today. John Walvoord's view is representative of this point of view. Says Walvoord, Matthew's Gospel does not answer the first question, which relates to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. This is given more in detail in Luke, while Matthew and Mark answer the second and third questions, which actually refer to Christ's coming and the end of the age as one and the same event. I agree with Walvoord's comment that Christ's coming and the end of the age are one and the same event. I disagree as to what the end of the age is and the meaning of the coming of Christ in the discourse. However, as we argued above, the end of the age does not refer to the end of the world, but to the end of the covenantal age of the Old Testament. See Robert Hilligan's The Early Date of Revelation and the End Times, page 99. It makes no contextual sense for the first question be left unanswered, given the urgency of the disciples' reaction in pointing out the buildings of the temple just after Jesus, hours earlier, prophesied the abandonment of the temple. If we can, in addition, show that the coming in Matthew 24, verse 20, is Christ coming in judgment against the temple and its corrupt leaders, Then the questions of the disciples in all three versions of the discourse are equivalent, and the answer of Jesus to the lead question was not left unanswered in Matthew's version of the discourse. The words, "The stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of heaven will be shaken," then apply to the destruction of the temple in AD 70.